Vítáme vás u dnešního speciálního dílu screenshotu Inspiračního fóra. Přinášíme záznam rozhovoru s Dorottyjou Rédai, který proběhl na konci října v rámci Jihlavského festivalu dokumentárních filmů. Rédai je maďarská akademička, jejíž obor, genderová studia, se na maďarských vysokých školách nesmí od roku 2018 vyučovat. S novinářkou Lindou Bartošovou hovoří o stavu svobody v Maďarsku i o budoucnosti tamní demokracie.
Dorottyjo, náš rozhovor měl v té přípravné fázi název nebo titulek Svoboda je pro všechny. Mě zajímá, jak velkou utopií je v současnosti toto motto, které by si asi přálo hodně lidí tady v té místnosti, v Maďarsku, což je země, které my jsme partnerem ve V4.
Well, it depends how we define freedom, but if we define it in political terms, I think it is a utopia at the moment because the current regime is more and more authoritarian and trying to reduce freedom of especially women and sexual minorities and also children. We will talk at some point about the fairy tale book. It also affects children's sexuality and children's rights to access information.
Vy jste před rozhovorem říkala, že už se aktivismu věnujete 20 let, takže máte možnost sledovat, jak postupuje vlastně útlak a nesvoboda ve společnosti, která se může v jeden bod zdát demokratická. Taky jste mi řekla, že si myslíte, že Maďarsko už není v tuhle chvíli demokracií. Tak mě zajímá jako možná i apel na nás, řekněme na českou společnost, která sice má své limity, ale pořád ještě můžeme svobodně říkat některé věci. Jak si dát pozor na to, aby se to nestalo? Jak to postupovalo?
Good question. Yeah, it's sometimes an issue like, how did we end up having this kind of regime, which started as a, conservative and progressive or left, right, liberal, etc. Political forces exchange each other. So it was not really foreseeable in 2010 that this is going to happen, but there were signs already then, especially regarding LGBT rights. So right from the beginning of Orbán's ruling in 2010, they immediately started to change laws, like to redefine marriage in the constitution as the union of a woman and a man, change the definition of family in family law to include the woman and the man and children, intentionally ignoring the diversity of families, not just LGBT families or rainbow families, but many other family forms and so on. And also they changed school curricula in 2012, 2013 to include a very conservative view of genders and making LGBT sexualities completely invisible, imposing rigid traditional gender norms. It's a kind of an indoctrination of children to these traditional gender roles, which in reality they don't really exist anymore because the world is changing and it's 21st century, so they're really outdated. So this was a long process, and it was in 2019 when the anti-LGBT propaganda became stronger. And this is happening in the regions, not only in Hungary. What's different is that in Hungary it's the government that pushes this anti-LGBT and anti-gender propaganda. And since the government has overwhelming majority in the parliament, they can introduce and accept any laws. They completely damage their opposition. This is where you can see that the backsliding of democracy and anti-gender and anti-LGBT politics are happening together and they support each other. So this is when politics, if it goes on this track, trying to reduce democratic rights, then one of the main pillars of this anti-gender politics. I mean, it's a warning sign when this starts to happen.
Vidíte tyhle varovné znaky i v jiných zemích V4, právě třeba na Slovensku? Mimochodem, vyjádřil se někdo z maďarské vlády k tomu útoku na Slovensku nějak, jakkoliv?
Yes, anti-gender politics is quite strong in Slovakia as well and also in Poland. Not so much in the Czech Republic as far as I know. But even in Poland, where the situation is just as bad or even worse than in Hungary regarding LGBT rights, there is still opposition to the government. So that's a big difference. And it's also a very telling thing that when the shootings in Bratislava happened, our government didn't say a word about it. And that was really shocking. I mean, shocking, but not surprising after all.
Zaznamenala jsem v té veřejné debatě v československém prostoru, teda si teď vypůjčím tento termín, že hodně lidí se aktivizovalo, hodně lidí podpořilo queer komunity, LGBTQI+ komunity, nebinární lidi, trans lidi, ale zároveň tam vznikaly otazníky, jak vlastně nemlčet, jak z toho prázdného pro někoho třeba hesla nebo nenaplněného mota udělat reálnou konkrétní věc, která může změnit tu situaci, která může změnit tu atmosféru, protože jasně, symboly jsou strašně důležitý a to, že se zaplní Václavské náměstí, to je naše náměstí v Praze, je hrozně důležitý. Ale jak se konkrétně aktivizovat v tom smyslu, aby se nestalo to, co třeba teď vrcholí v Maďarsku nebo v Polsku? Jestli za dobu vašeho aktivismu jste vypozorovala nějaké kroky, které můžeme jako společnost udělat?
I think it is very difficult to activate citizens nowadays. Something much more like elementary or more crucial or affecting more people have to happen. And this is actually happening in Hungary now. So now we are having enormous demonstrations for teachers because teacher situation is really bad in Hungary and the government is not doing anything. It's very important that solidarity is practiced and not just in speech, not just like signing petitions but like supporting each other, expressing support for another minority group, let's say. So maybe it's not my issue, but one day they might support me as well. So this mutual solidarity, I think, is really, really important and more important and active, like kind of radical solidarity. So like going there. What actually students are doing, all of the demonstrations for teachers now are actually organized by students because the situation in public education is really so devastating. It affects everyone, not just teachers, but obviously students as well, and parents and the whole society. And as an LGBT organization, we are also standing behind this. So we are going there like, yes, Labris is there and Labris is supporting teachers. And obviously there are lesbians among teachers. There are teachers among lesbians, so it's not like there are groups and they are not, everybody overlaps with, with somebody else. So social groups. So in all these discriminated or minority social groups, there are intersections with other social groups. So that's why it's so important to always express support, even if you are not personally affected. Because some in your group might be.
Takže nějaká intersekcionální podpora, řekněme, protože občas se objevují i hlasy, že ten, kdo není z té skupiny, tak by třeba neměl za tu skupinu mluvit, tak s tím vy nesouhlasíte.
You don't have to speak for them. You have to support them so that they can speak for themselves, I think. I mean, there are situations when you can speak for them. But you have to be very careful because, of course, it's always representatives of the group that know best what their problems and their interests are. But you have to support them so that they can express themselves. I think that's the best.
Zmínila jste vzdělání, zmínila jste situaci učitelů, která je kromě platů tristní i na jiných frontách, řekněme, když vlastně nemůžou, v podstatě to mě opravte, pokud to tak není, ale mám ten dojem z toho, co jsem četla, že gender je sprosté slovo, že queer lidi neexistují podle aktuálních maďarských osnov, podle toho, o co se Orbán zasadil. Vy jste proti tomu bojovala, řekněme, nebo vydala jste knihu A Fairy Tale for Everyone, která vyjde taky v češtině během několika týdnů. Nemáme ještě přesné datum, ale bude to brzy. Pod názvem Říše pohádek je pro všechny. Je to antologie 17 pohádek, z nichž 5 vystupují právě LGBTQI+ hrdinové a v tom dalším zbytku jsou znevýhodnění nebo jinak handicapovaní lidé. Tak mě zajímá, jak to bylo přijato v Maďarsku vlastně za celé té atmosféry, která tam je.
The story of this book is very interesting because our organization has an educational program. We've been working on educating young people about LGBT matters and discrimination and human rights for more than 20 years. And then we thought we should somehow reach out to younger children as well, because our school program is mostly for secondary school young people. So we thought that the fairy tale book would be the best tool for talking to younger people. And this was a pedagogical project. And when it got published 2 years ago, the political scene just exploded because one of the far-right politicians made a public performance of destroying the book. And this really triggered a lot of political and also education, professional, psychological responses from professionals. Big debate came about children's sexuality and how do children acquire their sexual orientation, gender identity. These were taboo topics before, and then suddenly everyone was talking about it, and then the book became a bestseller, and now it's published in 10 languages. The Czech is coming in a week or two. Yeah, so ironically, this is actually what made us so visible, in spite of the fact that the Orbán government tries to really suppress LGBT activism and tries to ignore us completely, but we cannot really be ignored anymore.
Ano, snahy o rozpoutání skandálu vyvolala Dora Duro, představitelka krajně pravicové parlamentní strany Naše vlast, která tu knihu veřejně skartovala, pokud vím. Kniha se teda, jak říkáte, stala bestsellerem. Gratuluju, to si myslím, že je nejlepší možný feedback, který mohl přijít. Mě zajímá ale to, jestli podle vás vychází všechny tyhle aktivity, ať už teda Orbánova snaha potlačit jakoukoliv osvětu na školách, tak třeba tyhle manifesty proti vám. Jestli to vychází ze strachu, protože já mám pocit, že se něčeho bojí.
I don't think it's fear. So I don't think that Orbán and his government is afraid of LGBT people. What LGBT people specifically, I think what they are trying to do is, it's important to see this whole, so all the things that are happening in the framework of this transnational anti-gender politics, because it's a global phenomenon, and those politicians who are pushing their anti-gender agenda they have a worldview, so they want traditionalist society where gender roles are very rigid and fixed, and women are subordinated, and the main meaning of their life is giving birth to children and so on. And they are trying to impose this ultra-conservative and outdated gender agenda on society. So they have a big political agenda. It's not really fear. I mean, yes, there is fear, more like general or ideological fear that the traditional nuclear family will be damaged by sexual minorities and other groups who are fighting for diversity and acceptance. Because the nuclear family is very important. It's the core of this traditional regime. It's not just about gender, it's also about nationalism, xenophobia. They are afraid that the nation state will be damaged, of which the core is the nuclear family. So I think it's very important to understand that this is not purely just about gender, but about the whole, what society is like or what society they want to have.
Když jsme si povídali opět před diskuzí, tak jste říkala, že už máte pocit, že vás začínají spíš ignorovat, že tyhle projevy okázalé nenávisti vůči vám nebo nepochopení vůči vám nahradila ignorance. Tak mě zajímá, co je vlastně pro vás těžší. Je to ten protitlak z jejich strany, anebo je to to, že dělají, že neexistujete?
What I meant was that, because you were asking whether I'm getting any threats or something from the government. So in that sense, I meant that they are trying to pretend that these LGBT groups don't exist on the one hand. Like, for example, when I got the Time 100 most influential people in the world last year, that's quite a big thing. And no governmental media was reporting anything about that. So as if I didn't exist.
Já se omlouvám, že jsem to neřekla na začátku. Ano, Dorottya byla ve stovce nejdůležitějších lidí podle časopisu Time.
Yeah.
Pardon, pokračujte, jenom jsem to chtěla ještě vypíchnout a dát tomu světlo.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it was obviously a political decision because the other Hungarian who got this nomination was Katalin Karikó, who invented the mRNA vaccine against COVID. So I don't think we are on the same level, but anyway. So on the one hand, they do try to ignore us, but at the same time, but they cannot really ignore us anymore because the movement got very strong exactly because of all this oppression. But on the other hand, they are also trying to introduce, these like false stories about us and demonize us, like we are part of the international gender lobby that comes from Brussels and is financed by George Soros, and we are trying to destroy the family, and we want everybody to have different gender every day, so it's kind of, these are quite irrational things, but for those people who only follow governmental media, which is not so difficult because most media is owned by the government. So I think that's also an important difference when we look at the countries in the region, like how the media is standing. Like in Hungary, there are only a few independent media sources are still existing.
Mě zajímá, jak se to vlastně všechno daří Orbánovi, opravdu mezi maďarským lidem. Jaká je vlastně podpora LGBTQI+ komunity a queer lidí v Maďarsku mezi lidmi, opravdu?
For Orbán to be successful, they had to change the election law in their first term. So now it's almost impossible for any other party to win an election. And by now it seems that he realized that like half of the country is enough for him. Because of the elections law, they can get 2/3 majority by about 40-something% of the votes. And people in the countryside are more supportive of him. So now he's very heavily focusing on, propaganda in the countryside. He gave up on Budapest because Budapest is in the opposition's hands, so to say. So his success is a kind of relative success, but I mean, in terms of numbers. That's why I'm saying it's not a democracy anymore, because they are playing by their own rules in which they cannot be defeated. So why is he so successful and what was the
Jestli máte pocit vlastně, že většina maďarské společnosti, jestli to na ní funguje, ta Orbánova propaganda, anebo jestli to jsou buď třeba zmanipulované průzkumy nebo obecně nějak ohnuté veřejné mínění. Jestli ta maďarská společnost jako taková je zmanipulovaná jím, anebo by ta situace byla úplně jiná, kdyby tam třeba ten Orbán a lidé kolem něj nebyli.
Obviously, we would probably still be living in a democracy, but what's interesting, and I think something hopefully subversive is going on, is that so half of the country votes for Orbán, the other half of the country hates Orbán. And those who hate Orbán hate everything he does. And now when he fights against LGBT people, those people who hate Orbán, even if they were homophobic before, now they cannot be, so they have to start supporting LGBT people. And this is very visible in the past years. We have never had so much support before. When the so-called child protection law was introduced last summer, in 3 days we could organize a demonstration where like 10,000 people were there and 100,000 signed the petition. This was never the case before. And the biggest thing was the referendum, the homophobic referendum, which was held on the same day as the national elections this April. And we're asking homophobic questions like, do you want your children to receive propaganda education about gender transition in school without parental consent, stuff like that. So LGBT organizations and human rights organizations, 16 organizations together, we were also involved. We ran an incredibly successful media campaign to convince people that they should vote invalidly, because the questions were phrased in a way that yes was not really an answer. So very manipulative questions. So to make the referendum non-binding, a significant number of people had to vote in an invalid way, like, crossing both yes and no. And 1.7 million people did that, which was like unbelievable. And actually, I have to say that since this referendum, we have been kind of left in peace. So I don't think this will last forever, but at least now we can take a break of fighting every day. But I think this must have been a warning sign for Orbán that maybe this, anti-LGBT politics is not so successful anymore. So he's probably working on figuring out who the next enemy could be. And if he chooses the next enemy, we LGBT people will have to support. So before LGBT people, it was migrants and refugees who were the main enemy. This can happen again, by the way, it might happen. But anyway, so whoever will be the next enemy, we will have to support their fight, and we will have to fight against that propaganda. So going back to, solidarity and collaboration.
Děkuju. Já bych teď chtěla dát první ze 3 možností tady publiku. Pokud se chcete na cokoliv zeptat, tak tady máme 2 dotazy, tak nejdřív v první řadě poprosím dát mikrofon.
Dobrý den, děkuji za dotaz. Musím říct, že já tady na hlavě už pamatuju diskuzí hodně, ale tahle je jedna z nejmotivnějších, protože mám ještě v živý paměti středeční Václavák. Chtěla jsem se zeptat, jak jednoduché nebo spíše složité je v Maďarsku možnost se veřejně vyautovat pro osoby z veřejného života, myslím sportovce, umělce. Nedělám si iluze, že by to bylo nějak jednoduché, ale jestli se to děje, protože přece jenom třeba v Polsku, kdy na tom práva LGBTQ lidí nejsou o moc lépe, tak měli tam například otevřeně transgender poslankyni. Tak jestli v Maďarsku existují nějací sportovci, sportovkyně, umělci, kteří veřejně jdou ven s tím, že jsou queer.
Děkuji moc za otázku. My jsme třeba teď, Dorottyho, jenom měli takový případ na Slovensku, kdy se vlastně veřejně vyautoval televizní moderátor v celostátním vysílání a myslím, že to velmi rezonovalo. Tak asi otázka směřuje, jestli máte podobné takové osobnosti.
Not a lot. Like there's one openly gay politician, not in Fidesz, of course. And very few public figures are out, but it's becoming a bit more frequent. So it was a complete taboo until a few years ago, and now some people are coming out and take on their orientation or identity openly. But yeah, I think that if somebody comes out now as a public figure, they will probably not get the same kind of bad treatment as before, like, excluding them. They will probably get a lot of hate speech on their personal Facebook or Instagram, but there will also be a lot of support for them. So Orbán is polarizing society, and that means that there are people who really, really hate LGBT people, but there are people who very much support them, and this supporting side is getting stronger. So there are much more people supporting LGBT people now than before.
Přece jenom udělám takový malý follow-up. Myslíte si, že kdyby bylo víc takových veřejných osobností, třeba z oblasti popkultury nebo médií, sportu, že by to zamíchalo kartami, nebo vlastně ta situace v Maďarsku je taková, že tohle už tolik nepotřebujete a potřebujete spíš, aby se konečně jako změnila ta vláda, legislativa a tak dále?
Yes, that's what we need. I don't think that this, a lot of people, a lot of celebrities came out, this wouldn't change politics. We need different regime. And since this is not a democratic regime anymore, it will not stop. So Fidesz members will not wake up one morning and say like, oh, actually, I've just realized that we are not doing well democratically, so let's stop and go back. It's not going back. So
byli jsme slepí a teď jsme se probudili, to se asi nestane, že jo?
I don't think so. So something radical will have to happen to overthrow this regime, I think. Because it's too far gone in authoritarian ways. And also very, very corrupt. And that's another important thing, that they are positioned everywhere for like 5-10 more years, and they own the whole economy, and some money goes around from one pocket to the other. So the whole regime has to be changed, and these people have to be eliminated from power and from positions where they can get even more money because they stole the country practically.
Myslím na vaši otázku, ještě jednu doplním. Jak by ta radikální věc, která to všechno změní, měla vypadat podle vás? Nějaká revoluce, anebo se bude čekat na to, až konečně zmizí?
He's not that old, he's not even 60, I think, so... I wish him good health, of course, but...
Samozřejmě nepodporujeme žádné násilí.
No.
Ani nikomu nepřejeme smrt, ale...
So if we wait until the end of his life, we will be suffering, I suppose, for another 20, 30 years. And he has his cronies, and he has the next generation of Fidesz politicians who are really like robots. It's incredible. They don't have their own thoughts about anything. They are just part of a system that just reproduces their own rhetorics and political and economic activities. So the regime has to be somehow overthrown. I don't know whether the solution is a revolution or not. I hope not, or I hope it won't be something violent or bloody, but something radical will have to happen, I think.
Tak vy jste se hlásil tady ve druhé řadě, poprosím.
Já bych se jenom vrátil k jedné otázce, která tady možná trochu zapadla, a to je k postojům té maďarské společnosti. V české společnosti je to asi tak, že v čase tady podpora politik ve prospěch narovnání nebo posílení práv queer lidí roste bez ohledu na to, jak vlastně vypadá politická reprezentace, která je většinově proti. Neustále, 30 let. A teďka mě zajímalo, jak je to v Maďarsku. Zda vlastně ta politika Viktora Orbána odráží to, co si většina společnosti myslí, nebo naopak je s tím v rozporu, co si většina společnosti myslí, anebo se to v čase nějakým způsobem ty postoje společnosti proměňují, protože ta politická moc něco prosazuje. Jestli můžete udělat nějaké jakoby ohlédnutí v čase a pokusit se o nějakou interpretaci. Děkuju.
It's a good question because, it's always like an interference between what the majority thinks and what politics says. But what we see is that social support for LGBT rights is growing. I'm not saying that the majority is now so supportive, but they're more supportive than before. So it seems like this LGBT hatred is counterproductive. And also because of today's younger generation, so teenagers and young people in their 20s, it's a different generation than ours and older, because for them it's so much more natural, to have LGBT people around, to talk about sexuality. They get a lot of information from all sorts of sources, internet and so on. So the teenagers I see, like, they don't even understand what this whole fuss is about. What's wrong with somebody not being heterosexual? So what? So I think the social change is coming mostly from young people. I think old people are more conservative or traditional, or they tend to be. But as I said, the preference or attitude towards politics, so whether you are on one side or the other, influences what you will think about LGBT people. So now they are connected. And I don't think that this trend, that support is growing more, will be reversed. It doesn't look like that.
Dobré odpoledne. Ona se pro tuhle otázku bude nutný trošku kontext, ale na konci roku 2020 v Bruselu europoslance za Fidesz Josefa Sajera přistihla policie v tom gay klubu a mě by zajímalo, nakolik zaprvé to nějak ovlivnilo tu diskuzi o LGBT tématice v Maďarsku a jak o tom informovala ta vládou ovládaná média.
There is no publicly owned media, really. There is Fidesz-owned media and private independent media. So this was the case when one of the founders and the most loyal members of Fidesz he was a founding member. It was, I don't know, I already knew in the 90s that he was gay, so I think everybody else knew probably. And he was the one who wrote the homophobic part of the constitution. He's a legal expert. So we don't like him, obviously, because of that. And when this thing happened, that he was caught in this sex party in Brussels, where he tried to escape through the water pipe. And they also found some ecstasy in his backpack.
Úplně vzorový konzervativní politik.
Yeah. That was so funny, really. I mean, he was really a subject of an incredible amount of jokes and memes and stuff. But Fidesz, they got rid of him like next day. So there's this enormous party loyalty. But if somebody does something like this, he was gone. Even though he was like founding member, most loyal, he was just gone. And in the governmental media, there was no news about this at all. So you could learn about this only in the independent media. they don't allow for such misbehavior. There's an enormous party discipline in Fidesz, and everybody has to say the same thing. And there are ongoing gossip about who is gay in the government. So like,
Chtěla jsem se na to právě zeptat.
But nobody. Yeah.
Pardon, klidně to dokončete, potom budu pokračovat.
Nobody unfortunately managed to reveal anyone, but we have suspicions about who these people are.
Ano, budu navazovat tím, kolik z těch strážců morálního řádu, řekněme, a starého konzervativního řádu v Maďarsku, ti, kteří vlastně utužují tu anti-gender a anti-LGBTQI plus propagandu, jsou podle vás ve skutečnosti součástí té queer komunity, jsou nevyautovaní a může to pramenit z nějakého, já nevím, strachu, snahy, aby se to v nich přetlačilo nějakým stylem. Prostě neschopnost si přiznat vlastně vlastní realitu a prožívání.
Well, this is a psychological question. So there's lots of psychological literature about it. I mean, those people who are the most homophobic and even aggressively homophobic, some of them are suppressing their own sexuality. I don't know what can be done about this. I mean, except going to a therapist. But, violently homophobic people, you don't usually go to a therapist saying like, oh, I have this problem and can you help me?
Bohužel. Předtím jsme mluvili o nějaké intersekcionální podpoře napříč komunitami, napříč nejrůznějšími menšinami, řekněme. Chtěla jsem se dostat taky k feministickým otázkám v Maďarsku, protože v březnu se novou maďarskou prezidentkou stala tedy žena, podle očekávání dlouholetá členka vládní strany Fidesz, Katalin Nováková. Zvolili parlament, ve kterém má Orbánova strana převahu. Tak mě zajímá, jak je na tom země s feminismem, protože možná se snaží Orbán právě skrze ní nějakým stylem říct, že vlastně tuhle věc řeší, ale přitom mám pocit, že je na tom země podobně v otázkách feminismu jako s queer právě, to znamená hodně špatně.
Yeah, it's as bad or even worse. So, as I said earlier, the core of anti-gender propaganda, one of them is LGBT rights and the other is women's rights. And the whole Orbán government's agenda is to reintroduce traditional gender roles. So they are not feminist, of course. They are not supporting feminism. They are supporting... But feminism was never really supported in Hungary, I have to say. If there was a very strong feminist movement before Orbán, maybe it would be different now. Maybe he wouldn't be able to be so anti-feminist. The fact that there's a woman as a president, so she's not like the Slovak president, of course. She's just a puppet like the previous president was. She's a Fidesz member. That's how democratic we are, that the president is a member of the leading party. The previous one was also a member. It doesn't mean anything. Actually, she's really homophobic. She was the one who initiated the law that after the fairy tale book was published, a few months later, the right for child adoption for LGBT people was taken away. And she signed this law. And the law said that from now on, single people cannot adopt children, only married couples. And this affected LGBT people because as an LGBT person, you could adopt children as a single person before. And now you cannot. If you are a single person, you have to ask permission from the Ministry of Family Affairs, which was her before she became a president. So her personal approval was needed if you were a single person and wanted to adopt a child. So that was, I think, really one of the ugliest things she could do. So much about her feminism.
Tolerantní a feministická figura, řekněme. Chtěla jsem se zeptat ještě na ta média, jak jsme to naťukli předtím. Existují vlastně nějaké platformy v Maďarsku teď pro svobodné, třeba queer, třeba feministické přemýšlení, které by nebyly úplně marginální, které by si člověk nemusel hledat těžko v nějakých skrytých skulinách mediálního veřejného prostoru?
I think you have to. But on the other hand, in the mainstream independent media, these topics are also finding their way more often. I noticed that in the leading independent papers in the past few years, a lot of young female journalists joined these papers. I mean, before that it was almost completely male-dominated, but now there are much more and young journalists, female journalists there. So I think that's a good sign. And they very often pick up feminist topics. So these issues and these topics become mainstreamed in the media, and I think that's a good thing.
Tak zeptám se na další vaše dotazy, jestli jsou nějaké.
Tak já mám otázku ještě zpátky k Fidesu a chtěla jsem se zeptat, jak si Fides udržuje legitimitu v očích voličů, když konstantně mění svoji agendu a prostě bylo s ním plno skandálů. Takže tak, to je všechno. Děkuji.
Díky moc.
Very good question. It seems like it doesn't really matter that they are changing their politics all the time. It's an interesting phenomenon. I mean, some of Fidesz voters it's almost like a religion. So whatever the Orbán government does is right. People follow them blindly. I don't know how they built this up, but it's a bit like a sect. Unfortunately, my own mother is one of these followers, and I'm just trying to understand how this can happen, that she's so brainwashed. And what she recently said, that she also reads independent media, so she is informed from both sides. And she still believes what Fidesz says. So they are very good at saying what they want to say in a way that people believe it. And they can always find an explanation for whatever they do. Now we have this enormous economic crisis. For 12 years, we had this campaign that they are keeping heating costs very low. And now they jumped up like 7 times higher. So people are frustrated, but they are still explaining that they are still keeping it lower than it would be if it was market price. So people are still believing that the government is still supporting their heating bills. And some people will not be able to pay those bills. But there still will be an explanation that, first of all, the enemy is always outside and they are trying to protect people as much as they can. So it's the war, it's the Ukrainians, it's the EU, it's never Russia, by the way. So there's always somebody else to blame, and they say that they are doing their best to fight these enemies who are trying to take away our rights and livelihoods. And maybe they cannot do more, but they are really trying hard and doing their best. And people believe this.
Jaké argumenty zapojovat? Protože možná každý máme někoho v rodině, komu musíme vysvětlovat základní, řekněme, lidskoprávní otázky. A je to velmi vyčerpávající a člověk se dostane do kouta, protože to opravdu chce vysvětlit, ale naráží do zdi. Jaké argumenty používáte třeba vy, tedy s vaší maminkou, která je podporovatelkou Fidesu, a vy jste vlastně lidskoprávník, queer aktivistka a tak dále, což jde proti Orbánově snaze?
Well, to be honest, I don't go against the wall anymore, not with her, so I can't. I mean, I hit my head so many times that it's not worth. As an activist, I can talk to more people than my mother, so just let her leave her like that, but I try to do, more things that impact more people. I can't help this situation. I can't help her thinking. She hasn't even read the fairy tale book because it's like, no, I'm not going to read such a book, so what can you do? So sometimes when you have like personal relations like this, you cannot really help, but you have to try elsewhere. It's easier to talk to people, I think, who are not so close to you. Because whenever you start arguing with someone who is like your family member or friend or something, you can always, get into a very triggering emotional issues. So maybe you don't have to start this within your family. You have to start elsewhere. You can start on Facebook. You can form your own community. You can be part of some organization, and then you talk to more people, not just one people who happens to be your mother.
Moc mě mrzí, že to zažíváte, teda potřebuji říct. Znamená to teda, že byste se nesnažila za každou cenu stavět ty mosty, za každou cenu hledat ty platformy pro komunikaci s těmi, kdo neposlouchají, neslyší nebo nechtějí slyšet. Jestli pak nehrozí to, že když se nesnažíme s těmi druhými mluvit, tak možná něco opomíjíme. Já sama vím, jak je to těžký, ale měli bychom se snažit víc, anebo spíš podporovat vlastně tu naší bublinu tak trošku.
No, I think we have to get outside our own bubble, but you cannot convince everybody. There are people who you cannot convince. Like, you don't start conversation with, with the Nazi, so it's pointless. You won't convince them. I think it's important to talk to people who are like not sure or don't really have an opinion or kind of, as we say in Hungarian, salon homophobe, like, they pretend they are not, but they have these ideas really. So those people can be moved and they are the majority. With extreme people, I don't think it's personally worth talking to because it can be emotionally very hard and pointless because they won't be convinced. And they are a minority, they are a small minority. So really, I think what's important is to talk to the majority who is like, yeah, maybe, actually, I don't have anything personally against gay people, but, I don't support pride because it's, these kind of, you can argue against these and very often successfully. You can't argue against gay people should be exterminated, What can you say about that?
Z čeho vlastně vychází ty extrémně silné heteronormativní standardy v Maďarsku? A proč se jich lidi podle vás tak zuby nehty drží? Právě ta skupina, o které jste mluvila, že vlastně cokoliv Fidesz udělá, nějak jim asi zásadně životy nezlepšuje a přesto jim stále věří.
It's very hard and I'm not sure it's specific to Hungary because these kind of thoughts are the same everywhere. But there is something about being post-socialist country and very often these people belong to older generations who had this regime, which they may have criticized, but they still somehow maybe feel at home in it, or they don't find it strange that they are not living in a democratic system because they are kind of used to other oppressive system. I don't know. I don't think it's something specifically Hungary or Fidesz does something very well to keep these people following them, but I think there's just a populist methodology of getting a lot of people follow them, but I don't think it's really specific. But there has to be a reason why within the region Hungary ended up like this. But I think a bit more time needs to pass before we can clearly figure out what is it specifically that happened. There's a lot of theorizing about this already, but I don't think we are there yet to see this clearly.
Myslím, že ty tendence jsou u nás taky, byť je ta situace asi pořád ještě o mnoho otevřenější než v Maďarsku. Přece jenom vidíte něco, co bychom třeba my Češi nebo Slováci po té strašné vraždě mohli dělat, abychom se, vlastně to se trošku vracím na ten začátek, ale pořád se snažím dobrat těch konkrétních věcí, které ta společnost může udělat preventivně, aby vlastně nedošlo třeba k tomu zákonu na ochranu dětí, jako k něčemu podobnému, co bylo v Maďarsku, prostě k těm konkrétním legislativním krokům, které plíživě přijdou a najednou vlastně ovlivní situaci tolika lidí v té zemi.
The difficulty is that, very often these decisions are made in the upper level of politics. So you don't necessarily have too much space to interfere with these laws. I think that today's politicians are very heavily polling what society thinks about what. So especially populist governments, they are running surveys every week about every question to figure out where their politics should go, because this is the thing with populism, that they don't really have any principles, just to get popular. So they are following popular opinion and that's where they are going. This is why public opinion is so important. So Hungary is specific because it's civil society. So like critical NGOs are the kind of the real opposition to the government because the political opposition is not really functional anymore. And that gives us a very big responsibility to do things and to try to make as many people as possible understand what's really going on and why it's a problem to introduce such laws and how it affects minorities and so on. So I think that's something that can be done, to talk about things really with people, not necessarily your mother, but so talking with people about, it's in people's mind that this is problematic, this is wrong. I think that people have to be more active in having conversations practically.
K té opozici existují vlastně alternativy v Maďarsku teď, které by přinášely naději na světlejší, otevřenější budoucnost, a nejenom směrem ke queer lidem, ale ke všemu?
I don't think this can come from the opposition parties. Because of their political situation, they are so unimportant. And in this kind of regime where only Fidesz can win, it doesn't make much sense to have an opposition. So they are humiliated on a daily basis. Whatever they introduce, it's never accepted. They never support anything that the Orbán government does. They oppose everything. So there's no constructive politics is done in the parliament at all. So I don't think that the solution will come from there.
A odkud myslíte? Protože já vím, že jste říkala, že je potřeba udělat něco radikálního. Samozřejmě si nepřejete nějaký násilný převrat nebo nějakou revoluci v této podobě. Přesto pokud to nevzejde od opozice, pokud to nevzejde teda takhle nějak od lidí, tak odkud to vzejde? A kdy? Vím, že je to těžká otázka.
It has to come from the people. It can only come from the people, I think. When and where and how, I don't know, but it will have to come from the people, definitely. I have a lot of trust in young people because as far as I see, there is a big generational change in thinking at this moment.
Rozumím naprosto, taky v to doufám. Tamhle jsem viděla vzadu zvednutou ruku, si můžu poprosit mikrofon.
Dobrý den, mě by zajímalo stav, kdyby Evropská unie udělala to, že by nějakým zásadním způsobem přistoupila k tomu, že Maďarsko vyloučí z unie. Jestli by to dokázalo s tou zemí nějak pohnout a nějaký právě třeba vyburcovat, nebo jestli si myslíte, že by to bylo spíš destruktivní a nic dobrého by to nepřineslo.
I hope this will never happen. But I don't think it will be positive. I think if the EU expulses Hungary, Hungary will just tie its bonds even stronger with other authoritarian regimes like Russia and China and Turkey and so on. They are already very good friends, so to say. So I don't think that would help people. It's interesting that the government has a very strong anti-EU rhetoric, but preference to be an EU member is one of the highest in Europe among the Hungarian population. I don't think this is more than rhetoric from Orbán, because as I said, he always needs some sort of external enemy, but I don't think that he would really want to leave the EU. And I really hope that the EU will not want to kick out Hungary, because that would be really bad for the people. Of course, it would be bad economically as well, but socially even more importantly. So.
Ještě chcete dodat něco? Tak ještě poprosím jednou mikrofon.
To jsem si právě taky myslel, ale právě spíš mi jde o to, jestli pokud by k tomu přistoupila, ve smyslu, že by to Unie myslela vážně, OK, vy porušujete už všechno, co vytváří Evropskou unii, vlastně v podstatě vy už jako, to už je jakoby příliš a jakoby opravdu tvrdě by k Maďarsku přistoupila, tak jestli by to právě ty lidi nevyburcovalo jako, hele, tady už jde fakt do tuhýho, my už třeba z té unie vypadneme. Jestli by to nemohl být ten rozhodující nějak jako posilovací faktor, který by proti tomu Orbánovi prostě nějak
jestli by tohle vlastně nebyl ten krok té radikality,
třeba,
řekněme.
ano.
Maybe yes, but the problem is that Orbán's followers would be presented with a very different story about this. So there wouldn't be enough people to protest, I think. Yeah, today's protests, like last Sunday, there was a protest in support of teachers where there were like about 100,000 people. It was really unprecedented almost during the Orbán regime. But in the government media, the report was that a couple of thousands of people were demonstrating. And so this is how it happens. It's just an example, but to show that this is how it happens. So that part of the country doesn't get the kind of information. They would probably be told, like, actually, we wanted to leave the EU to defend our national boundaries. It will be better for us like this and so on. So there wouldn't be enough people who would know the kind of reality that would be good to know in order to act against this. There would be like enormous protests and everything, but I'm not sure that in this regime such protests can do much. I have to say. A lot of people are leaving the country already to move to EU countries, you know. Like almost like 10% of the country has left since Orbán came into power.
Už žádný dodatek? Pokud ne, tak tady máme dotaz v první řadě.
Já teda nechci úplně přežívat tu úplně pozitivní náladu, kterou z toho rozhovoru zatím cítím, ale mě trochu překvapilo, že vlastně, že tam, kde čerpáte naději, respektive, že naději čerpáte z té mladé generace, protože v Česku se dlouho vlastně říkalo po roce 89, že musíme počkat, až vyroste nějaká generace nezatížená tím režimem a tak dál. A pak se vlastně ze sociologických výzkumů ukázalo, že prostě u dětí se prostě replikují názory velice často jejich rodičů a toho okolí a jak moc je to podložené tím socioekonomickým zázemím a tak dál. Je tohle v Maďarsku jinak? Mě vlastně překvapuje, že věříte tomu, že ta mladá generace těch voličů Fidesu může být jiná než ti voliči Fidesu, respektive všichni ti podporovatelé toho režimu, a že zrovna tam bude ten zdroj té změny.
I think that this is changing. This is different. That's another generation, not the one that we lost hope in after the regime change in 1989. I think this is again a new generation. So I see and I hope they have a different attitude to things. I might be wrong though, but I'm more positive now than I saw that the previous generation who are like now in their 30s, they are much more passive. They just want to fit in the system and just accommodate to, you know, all the capitalist demands of their parents grew up in socialism and they want to somehow adapt to the regime. And this generation, I mean, they are also very much adapted to the capitalist regime, but not so many of them are criticizing this, but they are criticizing other things. So if you look at both social media and also like mainstream media, there's going back to LGBT people, you know, LGBT people are getting mainstreamed. There was Me Too and people started to talk about sexual violence, you know, so these things are happening and this is what's affecting this generation more than the previous ones, I think. I mean, you are right that we mustn't be naively optimistic, obviously. You know, the Bratislava shooting was a point when we had to think about this. That person was also 19-year-old. And there is a certain part of society where these views are accepted. But I think that the parent of this person the father should take all the responsibility for this. So the most shocking part for me in the story was that the murderer was the son of far-right politicians. So this is where hate leads. And not only we lost two young LGBT person, but then the father also lost his son. So we have to be aware, even when we are doing activism and trusting in young people, that this is also present. So this is also, young people can also do this. So there are extreme views which they can succumb to. So you have to be alert to this as well, of course.
Já bych se ještě chtěla vrátit vlastně k struktuře strany Fidesz, protože vy jste ji přirovnala dřív k sektě a sekty jsou často založené na kultu jedné osobnosti. Tak mě by zajímalo, jestli má Viktor Orbán vůbec nějakého následovníka, protože třeba teďka jsme viděli, že i v Číně si prezident ujmul se větší moci, ale zároveň mám dojem, že nejen, že nemá konkurenci, ale nemá i následovníka. Tak jestli to v Maďarsku je podobné?
I think so. Yeah, Orbán certainly has a personal cult, and I don't see a person in the party who would be prepared for taking over his position. I mean, he should retire in 5-8 years, although he might want to remain a politician till then, because the previous elections he said that they want to be in power until 2030. But now his vision is that Fidesz will be in power till 2060 or so. I think that's what he said. But I don't see a figure who could follow. But I think when that becomes the issue, somebody will just emerge. I mean, these systems go and we know how this system works and they also know it very well. I'm sure they are studying, you know, the Chinese regime and Russia and so on. they borrow ideas from each other all the time.
Vy jste, na to navážu, vy jste říkala předtím, že strana Fidesz má spoustu takových malých robotů, kteří jsou vždy oddaní a schopní naskočit případně. Ale není tam teda jedna jediná výrazná figura, která by vlastně měla asi i pro voličstvo takové charisma, jako má Viktor Orbán, protože autoritářští vůdci často to charisma prostě mají silné. Nikdo takový tam není.
Yeah, because robots are not charismatic, So
True.
maybe he's making a mistake. Or maybe he just hasn't found a charismatic enough person to follow him. Don't know.
Což se ale může stát.
I guess so. Yeah.
Ještě jsem se chtěla vrátit vlastně i k té Evropské unii, jak jste to zmiňoval, jeden z vás. Protože Evropský parlament nedávno třeba řekl, stejně jako jste říkala vy, že Maďarsko už není demokracií. Kdyby se Evropská unie ještě výrazněji postavila právě třeba za LGBTQI plus komunitu v Maďarsku, kdyby vyvinula nějaké konkrétnější mechanismy, ne přímo, že by vyloučila Maďarsko z Evropské unie, což, jak jste říkala, by vlastně dopadlo na lidi velmi tvrdě a silně i na ty, kteří za to zkrátka vůbec nemohou. Měla by ale vyvinout ještě silnější mechanismy. Měly by prostě státy v Evropské unii, které ještě jsou demokratické, vyvinout větší úsilí na podporu lidí v Maďarsku.
I think that the EU only has one tool, which is money. And what's happening now in Hungary is that the EU is withdrawing a significant amount of money and forcing the Orbán government to change laws. And these laws are mostly related to corruption at the moment, but they may later come up with forcing the Orbán government to change laws that are related to human rights. And the Orbán government is now sheepishly trying to change these laws about corruption because they need the EU money, because Hungary is totally dependent on EU money for its economy. So I don't think the EU has another tool, at least rhetoric tools are not really helpful or even counterproductive. So when the so-called child protection law was introduced last year and there was very heavy EU criticism, Orbán can always turn the EU rhetoric. He can weave the EU criticism into his own rhetoric about how the EU is trying to oppress us and colonize us, and that it's the Orbán government who can protect the nation and they are doing their best to do so, and so on. So this kind of support is not really helping us at all. I mean, it's important for the activist community to feel that we are not alone, or we are supported. In other countries, people see what's going on here, so we don't feel isolated. So it's important for the community, but in general, it's not really helpful. Only the money works.
Je pro Maďary a Maďarky a všechny lidi v Maďarsku důležité cítit třeba podporu právě od lidí ze zemí ve Visegrádské čtyřce, třeba od Čechů a Češek?
It's interesting because the V4 union has kind of fallen apart now. So they practically kicked out Orbán because of the war, because Orbán's pro-Russia attitude. So it's not really working now. So even the other V4 leaders are criticizing Orbán, which must have been a shock for him, but he has other friends. So for us, yeah, I mean, the Central European, community that the V4 represents, I don't know. I mean, for me personally, it's a kind of homely feeling, or like comfortable that we have like similar cultures, or we kind of understand each other because of culture and history. And I'm sure that a lot of people feel like this, but politically I don't. It was important in the EU to have the V4 because before Orbán was kicked out recently, he was always saying like it's the V4 countries that will bring real change in the EU, and we will tell, how things should be because we know better. But it's not functioning now from Orbán's perspective.
Jak moc se vlastně bojíte toho utužování kamarádství a přátelství Orbána s Čínou a s Ruskem a s dalšími autoritářskými režimy potažmo?
They are already quite strong friendships. Orbán is very much supporting the Serbian political regimes. He's very good friends with Orbán, although now he is denying it, but it's obvious. There is something with Putin that I don't know. I don't know what Putin blackmails Orbán with. I don't know, really.
Mimochodem ani tohle nevzalo Orbánovi tu popularitu mezi voliči Fidesu. Ani to přátelství s Ruskem v této době, v době, kdy vede naprosto brutální a agresivní válku na Ukrajině už přes půl roku.
No, the Hungarian national radio and television and media are promoting the Russian propaganda better than Russia. Sometimes you can see reports about the war and why there is the war and who's responsible. It's really shocking how they are blaming Ukraine, and there is this theory that this is actually the war between Russia and America, and Ukraine is only a proxy. And Orbán believers listen to this all the time, and they believe it, including my mother. So recently we had a conversation about this, and that's where I was exposed with what these people really think about the war. It's quite shocking. So he has stronger friends. And that this is why it would be such a big problem if Hungary was kicked out of the EU, because then we would join these countries, and I think it would become a full dictatorship. And then if there was no control from democratic countries within the EU.
Máme nějaký dotaz? Formoval se v někom za těch posledních pár minut?
Já jenom mám spíš otázku trošku širší. Furt všechno svádíme do jisté míry správně na Orbána nebo na Putina a tak dál, ale já mám pocit, že to je prostě problém právě v té personifikaci, že je velký problém. Že vlastně hledáme novou filozofii ve skutečnosti a ta, že by pomohla. A nepomůže jako se obracet proti Orbánovi nebo Putinovi jako proti jednomu protivníkovi, který co si říká. Takže jestli máte někde v Maďarsku nebo kdekoliv jinde na světě pocit, že se rodí nějaká, řekněme, demokratičtější, ale smysluplná a použitelná vlastně vize, která má ale nějakou filozofii, která má nějaké zázemí, která teda nebojuje proti jednotlivcům, což je samozřejmě taky dobře, ale která má schopnost oslovit nejen teda možná lidi v Maďarsku, ale taky možná lidi v Africe nebo v Brazílii. Já mám pocit, že tohle absolutně chybí na světě a v tom, že je ten problém.
Yeah, I agree. I think saying Orbán all the time is kind of shortcut. It's a regime. It's not one individual. One individual couldn't build up such a regime. Neither Orbán nor Putin. It's a whole bunch of political, construction workers, so to say, who are responsible for developing this regime. But I agree that in our vision, we shouldn't focus on individuals, but on the regimes. I mean, they are the leaders of these regimes. As you were asking, so what happens if Orbán retires? The same regime may remain, so we have to deal with the regime, obviously, and also because these regimes are similar. So the authoritarian oppressive structures are very similar. They are using the same tools, even the same ideologies. And I think that's very useful and very helpful to think together with people who live in similar regimes and learn from each other, what you are doing in order to challenge the regime, because probably the solution has to come from a very broad base and not necessarily a nation-state base, but like a more international or global base, I think.
Ta situace není dobrá, myslím, že jsme popsali spoustu momentů, proč není dobrá a důvodů, proč spoustu lidí žije v Maďarsku v útlaku. Přesto, abychom neskončili tak temně, Dorottyjo, prosím, nějaké pozitivní poselství, message a možná i apel tady na mladé lidi, je jich tady hodně, vidím jich tady hodně, na to, co můžou dělat, že to opravdu pomáhá, i když to samozřejmě má svoje limity, jak jsme se bavili. Zkrátka nějaký váš vzkaz, který byste vyslala na závěr tady inspiračního fóra v hlavě.
Well, fairyland belongs to everyone. At the moment in Labris is kind of so it was established more than 20 years ago. The founders, I wasn't one of the founders, I joined a few years later, but we are all aging. So we are 20 years older now than when we established Labris. Most of us are middle-aged or even older. And now we have 2 young people who joined, and it's really incredible because they are full of energy. We are all burnt out, of course, but They are full of energy and they have totally different viewpoints about things and different knowledges, different professional knowledges that they can bring in. So it's very, very useful for the organization to have their knowledge and enthusiasm. And it's, of course, very difficult to work across generations. We have issues with that sometimes, but I would encourage, of course, young people to either to form your own groups and organizations or try to find the ones that already exist so that you don't have to invent the wheel all the time, because some organizations have the knowledge already, like how to function and how to do things, but maybe the things can be done in new ways or different ways as well. So I encourage everyone to form groups, any sort of groups, or join groups. Don't fight individually. You can be a Facebook fighter on your own. And that's also important because, half of our life is spent on Facebook and so on. But I think exactly because such a big part of our life is taken by virtual reality, we have to really cling to the non-virtual reality and stay there and find connections again and talk to real people and do things together. I think this is really important now because things have kind of shifted in a bit too much into this virtual direction. So I don't know, I can feel the strength of, when we sit down, like real people, real time talk, even when we have like our monthly meeting in Labris, when we meet online, like during COVID, nothing really happened. But if we sit together, like real time, real people, we are so much more creative and incredible, like brainstorming, and it's so funny. And, so there's such a big difference between like joining people, really. So I'm all for that.
Děkuju moc. Slíbila jsem taky, že na závěr sformuju pár hlavních myšlenek, tak myslím, že silná byla hned tahle poslední. To znamená, aktivizujte se, propojujte se v reálném čase, na reálném místě, generuje to skvělé věci a taky zábavu. A další, co jsem si napsala předtím, intersekcionální podpora, to znamená podporovat se napříč komunitami, menšinami. Nemusíte mluvit asi za ně, to třeba v některých momentech není úplně správně, ale minimálně pro ně to pomáhá. A další věc, že změna musí přijít od lidí, což vlastně propojuje všechny ty myšlenky. Dorottyjo, moc vám děkuju, že jste přijela na Jihlavu. Děkuju vám za vaší práci, za vaši odvahu. Díky moc za diskuzi. Díky. A děkuju vám.
To je z dnešního speciálního dílu Screenshotu vše. Rozhovor, který jste slyšeli, proběhl loni v říjnu v rámci 26. festivalu dokumentárních filmů v Jihlavě. Příští týden se můžete těšit na záznam rozhovoru s filipínskou umělkyní Kiri Dalenou. Ta na fóru hovořila s Anou Remešovou o své aktivistické tvorbě, která se vypořádává s politickou zvůlí a násilím na Filipínách. Podcastovou sérii Screenshot můžete odebírat ve svých podcastových aplikacích a všechny díly najdete také na webu inspiračníforum.cz/podcasty.